Hello, everybody. I'm Silas, and welcome to Psilocybology. Let's expand our mind. This is a series where we talk about the research on psilocybin, the psychedelic prodrug found in magic mushrooms. We'll be breaking down and discussing the scientific literature, one study at a time, from past to present. If you'd like to support the show, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Today's episode is on the article titled Reactions to Psilocybin Administered in a Supportive Environment, published in 1963 by researchers from Harvard University. Out of all of the studies we've talked about so far, this is one I would have really loved to conduct myself, albeit with quite a few important modifications. It's just a preliminary study, very explorational in nature, and not very methodologically complex. But I just got the impression from reading the manuscript that the researchers really cared about the experiences of everyone who participated, and that their intent truly was to determine how to produce meaningful and enjoyable psilocybin experiences. Specifically, they wanted to examine how set and setting influenced the experiences had by participants. They chose to do this by allowing for a wide range of variability in experimental conditions between participants. And then essentially in a series of post-hoc analyses, they looked to see if any particular variations in setting predicted how people felt about their experiences. Because there were no specific hypotheses being tested, the authors did stress repeatedly that these results are preliminary, and they would need to be confirmed through more rigorous testing. So interpret these results with that in mind, and be aware that it is possible some of the findings are spurious and may not be replicable. The way these researchers decided to capture a wide range of experiences was by, quote, imposing few preconceptions or rituals of their own on the experience. In other words, subjects were allowed to bring their own rules, roles, and games to the experience. In a lot of modern-day research, often the environments are kept rather controlled, where patients are asked to lay down on a couch in a fairly standard room and are given blindfolds and pre-selected music. This is for good reason, because researchers want to eliminate some of the noise and variability in experiences so that they can better determine how effective psilocybin is at treating a given outcome of interest. In the case of this study, however, that wasn't their goal, so they allowed participants to shape a lot of their own experiences. Music, books, and paintings were made available, as well as food and drinks. The experiments were mostly done in the homes of senior investigators, and participants went through the experience in groups that varied in number and appear to have been largely determined based on the participants themselves. They don't go into a lot of detail here, but it sounds as if participants sort of volunteered in groups. Essentially, if you had some friends or colleagues who wanted psilocybin, you just participated together. It definitely does not look like groups were in any way randomly assigned. Participants also notably got to choose their own dose of psilocybin, although most picked either 12 milligrams or 20 milligrams, because these were framed by the researchers as a moderate and a full dose, respectively. Interestingly, in each of the trials, one of the experimenters also took psilocybin with the participants in order to, quote, create a sense of equality and shared experience, and to dispel the fear that often accompanies relationships between experimenters and subjects. Now, although many of the participants were graduate students, professional writers, artists and musicians, psychology professors, and stay-at-home moms, there's one additional group we need to spend a bit of time addressing in particular. In addition to the aforementioned groups, some of the participants were prison inmates. At first glance, some people might not think too much about the implications of this, but there's a reason why, by today's standards, prisoners are formally considered a vulnerable population, because the mere conditions involved with being incarcerated impact an individual's ability to give voluntary informed consent. Granted, this study has a much more ethically sound methodology than the prior studies we've discussed that shamelessly experiment on prisoners. For instance, all participants in this study were explicitly taught what psilocybin does and what the experience would be like prior to going into it. Although they did not participate in the researchers' homes like the other participants, The researchers did use a private room in a prison hospital, furnished with beds, tables, and chairs, and they also brought the same books, musics, and paintings along with them. They also, notably, as we mentioned, got to choose their own dose, giving them a greater sense of autonomy. And lastly, the researchers noted that no participants, inmate or otherwise, were paid. So you might be able to argue that volunteers were more likely to be genuinely interested in the experiment rather than just doing it for the compensation that they would have a difficult time saying no to, given their situation. That all said, as Harriet Washington discusses in her book, Medical Apartheid, quote, "A stint in the lab offered a respite from the ever-present threat of gang rape, shakedowns, racial strife from prison gangs, and deadly assaults for 1,000 petty slights." The reason this is important is because it calls into question whether they were truly voluntary participants, or if they merely agreed to participate because of the reprieve the experiment brought. If they were not in prison, would they still volunteer? In addition, if this study was aimed specifically at testing whether psilocybin administration improved the lives of inmates, then I think the methodology here would actually be appropriate, because then the individuals participating, and thus accepting the risks involved, would also be the same people who are potentially benefiting from the research. This study, however, was not designed to improve the lives of inmates, and that to me is one of the key issues with this experiment regarding their use of this vulnerable population. I actually think that supportive psychedelic-assisted therapy to improve the lives of prisoners would be a really interesting line of work, although I'd first want to see that those who are incarcerated for drug offenses are released, because they shouldn't be there in the first place. The last thing I wanted to mention about the participants, while we're already on the topic of vulnerable populations, is that the researchers noted that one individual participant was pregnant. They stated that she volunteered upon the knowledge and approval of her obstetrician, but during the same period of time, pregnant women were sometimes encouraged to drink alcohol to avoid premature labor, so the approval doesn't say much. Now, this is by no means an endorsement of taking psilocybin during pregnancy, but I do have to say that I would love to meet the kid. And there's a good chance they're alive, since they would have been born around 1963, depending on how much time there was between the actual experiment and the paper being published. But alas, I think unless the individual is both aware that they unknowingly participated in the experiment, and also happens to be listening to the podcast, I don't see that happening. Just more reason, though, to tell everyone you know about the podcast. If you happen to have at least 4 other siblings, because apparently this was her 5th pregnancy, you think your mom may have taken psychedelics, and you were also born around this time, likely in Massachusetts, feel free to reach out. On a bit of a lighter note, this reminded me of a joke Ali Wong made in one of her comedy specials. I won't spoil the joke, but if you search on YouTube Ali Wong Bad Mommy, you'll find it. So now that we've thoroughly covered the participants, let's finish up discussing the methods. Once participants were informed about what psilocybin was, they formed their group, and they selected their dose, they were then administered the psilocybin and were allowed to do whatever they wished for the duration of the experience. After it was all over, they were given a questionnaire and were asked to write about how they felt. Although a total of 175 individuals participated, with 127 being male and 48 female, averaging an age of 29.5 years old, only 98 participants apparently returned the questionnaire, so the analyses are based on those individuals only. It sounded like they may have given the questionnaire as participants left and then asked them to return them, which, if that is the case, is just asking for failure, in my opinion. This is an important limitation, because we do not know if there are any systemic factors influencing why some individuals completed the questionnaire and not others. Were those who enjoyed the experience, for example, more likely to complete the questionnaire than those who did not? Personally, I'm not sure why they didn't administer the questionnaire before participants left. And actually, I'm also not sure why they didn't give a pre-questionnaire as well, so that they could at least look to see if there are any differences between those who did and did not complete the study. So again, take the results with a handful of salt. Just because they're from Harvard doesn't mean they're good at research. I'm still the most impressed by the methodological rigor of the spider study from episode 11. Those researchers from sunny upstate medical campus knew what they were doing. Anyway, from the 98 participants, the average dose administered was 0.26 milligrams of psilocybin per kilogram of body weight. So for someone weighing 70 kilograms or 154 pounds, that's about 18.2 milligrams of psilocybin. One of the first pieces of data they report on is in response to a question asking them how many hours they thought someone should have been with them to help and be a companion. On average, they responded with 2.9 hours. I really liked this question because even though their experiences lasted between 4 to 6 hours, it's cool to see how long until people feel a bit more grounded or at least familiar with the experience enough to be comfortable on their own. After 3 hours, it sounds like most people were over the hill, so to speak, and the intensity of their trip was diminishing. Next, the authors report on some of the responses to the questions asking participants to rate subjective aspects of their experience. They noted that 78% of participants reported that the experience was either mildly or very supportive, with 10% reporting it was neutral, and 11% reporting it as rejecting. 70% indicated that the experience was either very pleasant or ecstatic, with 23% reporting that the experience was just okay, and 7% reporting it as unpleasant. 45% indicated that they either learned a lot or a tremendous amount, 43% indicated that they at least learned something of value, and 11% indicated that either they learned nothing or were more confused after the experience. Now, I'd actually argue that question is flawed because being more confused very well might be a good indicator that you did actually learn a lot. Anyway, 62% said the experience changed their life for the better, 37% reported no change, and 1% reported the experience made their life worse. Notably, the amount of knowledge gained was strongly and positively associated with reported change in life, meaning the more they learned about themselves and the world, the more impactful the experience was. The reason I think that is important to highlight is because the psilocybin experience to me does not appear to be passively very meaningful. It does induce an altered state of consciousness, which is valuable to a certain extent in and of itself. But from there, what you decide to do in that state will shape how much you ultimately take away from the experience. Overall, the majority of experiences were fairly positive, which is shown by the fact that 90% of participants said they'd want to try mushrooms again, 6% said they didn't care either way, and only 4% said they'd rather not. Another question I want to discuss, although primarily to pick it apart, asked participants, quote, "To what extent was your experience perceptual with actual images or forms as opposed to abstract?" The first problem I have is that unless they defined what they meant by abstract, which I believe a better word that describes what they were going for would be cognitive, the question can definitely be a bit confusing. The second reason I have a problem with this question, as many of you might have already guessed, is that it presupposes that experiences are either perceptual or abstract, that these are two ends of a single spectrum, when really they are separate features that can both occur during a single psilocybin experience. The response with the highest percentage of endorsements was right in the middle, between the options mostly perceptual and entirely abstract. Probably the most unique piece of information from this study, partially because I don't believe any of the previous studies up to this point administered psilocybin in large groups, which in this study the group size ranged from 2 to 21 people, was their examination of how group size was associated with the subjective experiences reported by participants. Specifically, they found that the larger the group size, the less supported participants felt. I personally don't find that incredibly surprising, although I wish they presented a histogram or something so we could see if ratings of supportedness dropped off around a certain number. They also found that in larger groups, people tended to report that their experiences were more personal rather than interpersonal. By interpersonal, they specifically meant the experience involved sharing something with others, whereas personal trips were when people spent more time to themselves. This reminded me of the Great Gatsby quote, "I like large parties, they're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy." The reason it reminded me of this is because we essentially see that replicated here. In small groups, people appear more likely to engage in interpersonal activities, whereas in larger groups, there's the opportunity to retreat into yourself without drawing attention. This may also, however, be explained as a result of larger groups feeling less supportive, and thus more rejecting, which were both also associated with experiences that were more personal rather than interpersonal. This is all speculation, and one would need to test this by manipulating these variables and examining how they influence the type of experiences reported. The last bit of data I want to cover from the study comes from a subset of 35 participants who participated in the experiment a second time. Using this data, the researchers examined how variables from the first experience correlated with those of the second experience. There is one key finding from these analyses I want to leave you with. The researchers found that the more a participant learned during the first experience, and the greater impact the first experience had on their life, the more interpersonal the second experience was. On the flip side, the more a person wanted to talk with the psychiatrist, which was on site for the duration of all the experiments, during the first experience, the more personal, rather than interpersonal, the second experience became. Based on this, the authors proposed the following, quote, that two divergent outlooks on the use of these experiences developed. They were used either for increased communication between people or for analytic self-exploration. Well, that's it for today's episode. As always, I really hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any questions, feedback, or ideas for the podcast, please let me know. You can find out all the ways to reach me on the website, psilocybology.org, where you can also find the full transcript for each episode if interested. Thank you all for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.